Jim Crow was not an actual person. So what were Jim Crow laws?
That's a really good question.
Jim Crow laws used to be laws in the South which were based on race.
Jim Crow laws were laws that were created for segregation between white people and black people in public locations like schools, buses and transportation, restrooms, as well as restaurants.
The word segregation means keeping certain people apart.
And Jim Crow laws also made it challenging for black people to be able to vote.
Jim Crow laws originated in the late 1870s all the way up until the civil rights movement that started in the 1950s.
So why were they called Jim Crow?
The name Jim Crow comes from an African American character in a song from a stage show that started in 1828.
This type of show was called a minstrel show, and it included performances that encouraged a negative view of African Americans.
The term Jim Crow was a name used for African Americans. The laws for segregation then became known as Jim Crow laws.
When the Civil War ended, the U.S. government attempted to support the rights of ex-slaves in the South through a process named Reconstruction.
But in the year 1876, Reconstruction ended, and lawmakers in southern states passed laws requiring that white people and black people must attend different places. They had to go to separate schools, as well as sit in separate areas on public transportation.
By the 1890s, the southern states' legislatures were all white again, and former slaves that were now free had reduced rights under the Jim Crow laws.
Southern Democrats did not support civil rights for African Americans. The Southern Democrats completely ruled the South, which gave them a lot of power in the United States Congress.
Black people and white people were made to use separate drinking fountains, waiting rooms, houses, stores, and even extended to parks, cemeteries, theaters, and restaurants.
Segregation then spread beyond the South into other states. Each state created its own version of Jim Crow laws.
And these laws didn't just affect African American people, but many other racial and ethnic people who were not considered white.
Signs were hung showing where people of color were not allowed to go.
And southern states also added laws that required voters to pass a literacy test before they were given permission to vote.
Many Black Americans from the South did not know how to read because of the previous laws that prevented slaves from education.
This meant a majority of African Americans were not allowed to vote, which is called disenfranchisement. And because they could not vote, they also could not be on juries in court.
Even the U.S. Army had segregation, and it stayed that way until 1948.
And it was President Harry S. Truman who was the president that desegregated the Army through an executive order called 9981.
Many southern states formed laws called black codes and tried to maintain something like slavery in the South even after the Civil War.
These were even worse than Jim Crow laws.
And unfortunately, these laws made it very challenging for black people to leave their jobs. And believe it or not, they could also be arrested for almost anything that they did.
The Civil Rights Act of 1866 as well as the 14th Amendment attempted to end the black codes.
However, in 1896, the United States Supreme Court ruled that these laws were in fact legal in a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson.
The ruling said having things be separate but equal was okay.
However, black schools as well as black libraries received a lot less money and funding and ended up not being as good as the places that were made for white people.
It was obvious that things were separate but not equal.
And during this time, as many as 6 million African Americans moved to the north and west of the United States, and this was to be able to escape the Jim Crow laws of the South.
This is referred to as the Great Migration.
President Woodrow Wilson grew up in the South and supported Jim Crow laws everywhere during his presidency.
The government ignored every complaint or protest, even when Jim Crow laws permitted murder without the option of a fair and just trial.
Then President Wilson selected Southern representatives to his cabinet.
And it was these representatives that made sure that laws were not passed allowing any additional freedoms to black Americans.
African Americans began fighting segregation by organizing, protesting, and fighting segregation and Jim Crow laws in the 1900s.
The Supreme Court stated that segregation of schools was illegal in the famous Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954.
And this decision was the beginning of the end for Jim Crow laws.
And it was things like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign, and the March on Washington that brought the subject of Jim Crow laws to national attention.
And finally, Jim Crow laws were made illegal when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 occurred. Well, hey, guess what? Now we all know about what the Jim Crow laws were.
Thanks for watching.
Make sure to subscribe.
Bye.